The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Dr. Margaret Thornfield made her way through the grand corridors toward the king's private chambers. Her medical bag felt heavier than usual, weighted down not just by instruments, but by the gravity of the news she carried. The ornate grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through the silence that seemed to pervade the entire castle. Margaret had been the royal physician for nearly 15 years, having served through some of the most challenging moments in the monarchy's recent history. She had witnessed births, deaths, celebrations, and crises, but nothing quite like what she was about to deliver to the private secretary waiting outside the king's door. The test results that had arrived just 2 hours ago would change everything. Sir Edmund Hartwell stood with his usual military bearing, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the early hour. His eyes, however, betrayed the worry that had been building over the past several weeks. The king's condition had been declining steadily, and everyone close to him could see it, though they had hoped against hope that it was merely the stress of recent state affairs taking its toll. "Doctor," Sir Edmund greeted her with a slight nod. "His Majesty is awake, but still quite weak. The Queen is with him now." Margaret paused, her hand on the brass door handle. Through the heavy oak, she could hear the soft murmur of conversation between the king and queen. After 47 years of marriage, they had developed their own language of comfort, speaking in gentle tones that somehow conveyed more than words ever could. The thought of disrupting their peaceful moment with such devastating news made her stomach tighten. "Sir Edmund, perhaps we should speak privately first," Margaret suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "The results I received this morning require careful consideration of how we proceed." The private secretary's face grew pale. In all his years of service, he had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded major announcements. The way Dr. Thornfield avoided direct eye contact, the slight tremor in her usually steady hands, the formal tone she adopted when delivering serious news. All of these pointed to something far more serious than they had initially feared. They moved to a smaller adjoining room, one that had served as a study for generations of royals. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, their spines bearing the gold-embossed titles of classics and historical texts. A portrait of King George VI hung above the fireplace, his steady gaze seeming to watch over the conversation that was about to unfold. "The specialists at London Hospital have confirmed our worst fears," Margaret began, settling into one of the high-backed chairs near the window. "The symptoms we've been monitoring, the fatigue, the weight loss, the episodes of confusion, they're not related to stress or overwork as we had hoped." Sir Edmund remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that had become second nature during decades of receiving difficult briefings. "What exactly are we dealing with, Doctor?" Margaret opened her medical bag and withdrew a manila folder containing the test results and consultation notes. The pages were marked with various stamps and signatures, the official documentation of a diagnosis that would soon send shockwaves through the monarchy and beyond. "The neurological examinations have revealed signs of early-stage dementia, specifically a form that tends to progress more rapidly than typical Alzheimer's disease," she explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "The specialists believe the condition has been developing slowly over the past 2 years, which explains the gradual changes we've all noticed in His Majesty's behavior and cognitive function." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Sir Edmund slowly lowered himself into the chair opposite Dr. Thornfield, his usual composure finally cracking to reveal the deep concern he had been harboring. As the king's closest advisor and confidant, he had noticed the small changes before anyone else. The occasional forgotten names, the repeated questions, the moments of confusion during complex discussions about state matters. "How long do we have?" Sir Edmund asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "That's difficult to predict with certainty," Margaret replied, consulting her notes. "The specialists estimate that His Majesty may have anywhere from 6 months to 2 years before the symptoms become impossible to manage discreetly. Much will depend on how quickly the condition progresses and how well he responds to the treatment options available." Through the thick walls of the castle, They could hear the distant sounds of the morning routine beginning. Staff members going about their duties, the gentle clatter of breakfast preparations, the soft footsteps of security personnel making their rounds. Life was continuing normally throughout the palace, unaware that everything was about to change. Sir Edmund stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured gardens where the king had spent countless hours over the decades. The rose garden that had been his particular pride, the oak trees planted to commemorate various royal occasions, the pathways where he had walked with visiting dignitaries and family members. All of it would soon take on a different meaning as the king's ability to enjoy these simple pleasures began to fade. "We need to consider the implications for the monarchy," Sir Edmund said, his voice taking on the practical tone he used when addressing matters of state. "There are constitutional questions that must be addressed, succession planning that needs to be reviewed, and public communication strategies that require careful development." Margaret nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation they faced. Unlike a private family dealing with such a diagnosis, the royal family's struggles would inevitably become public, subject to intense scrutiny and speculation. Every appearance, every speech, every public engagement would be analyzed for signs of the king's declining condition. "The Queen will need to be informed immediately," Margaret continued. "Her support will be crucial in the coming months, both for His Majesty's emotional well-being and for maintaining the stability of the royal household. She has always been his strongest advocate and will undoubtedly want to be involved in all decisions regarding his care." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. A gentle knock on the door was followed by the familiar voice of Mrs. Patterson, the king's longtime personal assistant. "Sir Edmund, His Majesty is asking for you. He seems quite alert this morning and wants to discuss the schedule for next week's state visit." Sir Edmund and Dr. Thornfield exchanged a meaningful glance. The irony of the king wanting to plan for future engagements, unaware that his ability to fulfill such commitments was now in serious question, was not lost on either of them. "We'll be right there," Sir Edmund replied, then turned back to Margaret. "How do we tell him? And when?" "I believe he should hear it from both of us together, with the Queen present," Margaret said, gathering her papers and returning them to the folder. "He deserves to understand what he's facing, and he'll want to be part of the decisions about how to handle the situation. Despite the diagnosis, his cognitive function is still largely intact, particularly in familiar settings and during his better moments." They made their way back to the king's chambers, where they found him sitting up in bed, dressed in his favorite burgundy robe. The Queen sat beside him in an elegant chair, her silver hair catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. Despite being in her late 70s, she maintained the poise and grace that had made her a beloved figure throughout her decades of public service. "Good morning, Dr. Thornfield." The king greeted her with a warm smile. "I trust you've come to tell me that all those tests were unnecessary worrying, and I'm simply getting old like everyone else my age." The hopeful tone in his voice made what Margaret had to do even more difficult. She could see the Queen's eyes searching her face for any sign of good news, and the disappointment she would soon have to deliver felt like a physical weight on her chest. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid the results require a serious discussion," Margaret began, settling into the chair that Sir Edmund had positioned for her. "The specialists have identified the cause of the symptoms you've been experiencing, and while we now have a clear diagnosis, the news is not what we had hoped for." The king's expression grew more serious, and he reached for the Queen's hand. Their fingers intertwined in a gesture that spoke of decades of facing challenges together, of supporting each other through the inevitable difficulties that came with their unique position in the world. "Please, doctor, speak plainly," the king said. "We've faced many difficult situations together over the years. Whatever this is, we'll handle it as we always have." Margaret took a deep breath and began to explain the diagnosis, using terms that were clear but not unnecessarily clinical. She spoke about the brain changes that were occurring, the likely progression of symptoms, and the various treatment options that might help slow the condition's advance. Throughout her explanation, she watched both the king and Queen carefully, ready to pause if either of them needed time to process the information. The king listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about the medical details and the prognosis. His response was remarkably composed, reflecting the self-control that had been ingrained in him from childhood. The queen, meanwhile, maintained her outward calm while gripping her husband's hand tightly, her knuckles white with the tension she was struggling to contain. "So we're looking at a progressive condition that will eventually affect my ability to carry out my duties," the king summarized after Margaret had finished her explanation. "The question becomes not whether this will impact the monarchy, but when and how we manage that transition." Sir Edmund nodded, impressed once again by the king's ability to focus on the broader implications, even when facing such personal, devastating news. "Your Majesty will need to develop a comprehensive plan that addresses both your medical care and the constitutional requirements. The priority must be ensuring a smooth transition that maintains public confidence in the institution. And the family," the Queen added, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. "Our children and grandchildren will need to be informed carefully. They'll want to spend more time with their father while he's still fully himself, but we also need to prepare them for what's coming." The morning sun had risen higher during their discussion, casting longer shadows across the ornate carpet. Outside, the sounds of normal palace life continued, gardeners tending to the grounds, staff members going about their duties, visitors arriving for scheduled appointments. The contrast between the ordinary world continuing outside and the extraordinary conversation taking place within the king's chambers seemed surreal. "There's also the matter of public disclosure," Sir Edmund continued. "We can maintain privacy for a while, but eventually the changes will become noticeable. We need to consider how and when to inform the public and what level of detail to provide." The king was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gardens he had tended for so many years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime putting duty before personal desires. "I want to continue fulfilling my responsibilities for as long as I'm able," he said firmly. "But I also want to ensure that the monarchy remains strong and stable. If that means beginning a gradual transition of duties to ensure continuity, then that's what we must do." The Queen squeezed his hand again, and Margaret could see the love and admiration in her eyes. After nearly 5 decades of marriage, she had watched her husband navigate countless challenges with grace and dignity, always putting the needs of the nation before his own comfort or convenience. "We'll take this one day at a time," the Queen said softly, "and we'll make sure that whatever decisions we make, they're made together as a family and as partners in this role we've shared for so long." Dr. Thornfield gathered her materials, knowing that this conversation was just the beginning of many difficult discussions that lay ahead. The medical aspects of the king's care would be challenging enough, but the unique circumstances of treating someone whose every move was scrutinized by the public would add layers of complexity that few physicians ever had to navigate. "I'll arrange for regular consultations with the specialists in London," she said, rising from her chair. "And we'll establish a monitoring system that allows us to track any changes in His Majesty's condition while maintaining the privacy and security that the situation requires." As she prepared to leave, Dr. Thornfield couldn't help but reflect on the remarkable composure both the king and Queen had shown in the face of such devastating news. Their focus on duty and continuity, even in the midst of personal crisis, exemplified the dedication that had defined their decades of service to the nation. 3 weeks had passed since the devastating diagnosis, and the carefully constructed routine of palace life had begun to shift in subtle but significant ways. The changes were so gradual that most of the staff remained unaware of the gravity of the situation, but those closest to the king could see the delicate adjustments being made to accommodate his evolving needs. Prince William arrived at Windsor Castle on a gray Tuesday morning, his face bearing the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights grappling with information that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the future. The conversation with his father about the diagnosis had taken place just 5 days earlier, and he was still processing the implications for both his family and the institution he would one day inherit. The prince found his father in the morning room, reviewing correspondence with the assistance of a private secretary. The king appeared alert and engaged, discussing various matters of state with his usual attention to detail. To an outside observer, nothing would have seemed amiss, but William could now recognize the subtle signs that Dr. Thornfield had taught him to watch for. The slight hesitation when searching for certain words, the way his father relied more heavily on written notes than he had in the past, the occasional moments of confusion that were quickly masked by years of diplomatic training. "William, good morning." The king greeted his son warmly, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. "I was just finishing up some correspondence regarding the Commonwealth Conference next month. Your mother mentioned you wanted to discuss the arrangements for the upcoming state visit." William settled into the chair across from his father, noting how the queen discreetly remained nearby, ready to assist if needed. Her presence had become more constant in recent weeks, though she managed to make her increased attention appear natural and unobtrusive. The partnership that had sustained them through decades of public service was now being tested in ways they had never anticipated. "Actually, Father, I want to discuss something more significant," William began carefully. "Dr. Thornfield and Sir Edmund have briefed me on the medical situation, and I think we need to have a frank conversation about how we move forward as a family and as an institution." The king's expression grew more serious, and he set down his reading glasses with deliberate precision. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the lines on his face that seemed to have deepened over the past few weeks, evidence of the stress he was experiencing despite his outward composure. "I appreciate your concern, William, and I understand your desire to be involved in planning for the future," the king replied. "But I want to make it clear that I have no intention of stepping back from my duties prematurely. As long as I'm capable of fulfilling my responsibilities, I intend to continue serving." The determination in his father's voice reminded William of conversations they had shared throughout his life, moments when the king had emphasized the sacred nature of their duty to the people. But now that unwavering commitment to service was complicated by medical realities that couldn't be ignored or overcome through sheer willpower. "I'm not suggesting you step back immediately," William clarified, "but I think we need to be realistic about what the coming months and years might bring. Dr. Thornfield has explained that the condition will progress, and we need to ensure that the monarchy remains strong and stable throughout that process." The queen, who had been quietly listening from her position near the window, moved closer to join the conversation. Her presence brought a calming influence to what could have become a tense discussion between father and son, two men who both deeply loved the institution they served, but who might have different perspectives on how best to protect it. "Your father and I have been discussing this extensively," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had made her such an effective partner to the king throughout their marriage. "We understand the challenges we're facing, and we're committed to making decisions that serve the best interests of the monarchy, even when those decisions are personally difficult." William nodded, grateful for his mother's diplomatic approach to what was an extraordinarily delicate situation. The balance between respecting his father's autonomy and dignity while also ensuring the continued effectiveness of the monarchy required careful navigation that could easily be disrupted by well-meaning but poorly timed interventions. "Perhaps we could start by identifying areas where additional support might be helpful," William suggested. "Not replacing your involvement, but rather strengthening the team around you so that you can focus your energy on the most important aspects of your role." This approach seemed to resonate with the king, who had always valued efficiency and strategic thinking in matters of governance. He leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal with the analytical mind that had served him well throughout decades of leadership. His timing was perfect, as the conversation had reached a point where practical planning needed to begin in earnest. The private secretary had spent the past few weeks consulting with constitutional experts and palace officials to understand the options available for managing a gradual transition of responsibilities. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," Sir Edmund greeted them formally before settling into the remaining chair. I've prepared some preliminary recommendations for how we might structure a gradual delegation of duties that maintains public confidence while accommodating the medical realities we're facing. The documents he produced outlined a carefully crafted plan that would slowly shift certain responsibilities to other members of the royal family, beginning with the least visible duties and gradually expanding to include more prominent roles. The strategy was designed to appear as a natural evolution rather than a response to health concerns, preserving the king's dignity while ensuring institutional continuity. The Commonwealth Conference next month could serve as a good testing ground, Sir Edmund suggested. We could arrange for Prince William to take the lead on certain aspects of the visit, while Your Majesty focuses on the most ceremonially important elements. This would allow us to evaluate how such an arrangement works in practice. William studied the proposed schedule, noting how thoughtfully it had been constructed to maintain his father's central role while providing backup support for more demanding aspects of the visit. The plan reflected a deep understanding of both the medical challenges they faced and the political sensitivities surrounding any changes to the king's public role. "This seems reasonable," William said, looking to his father for approval. "It would also give me valuable experience with these types of state functions while ensuring that nothing falls through the cracks if you're having a difficult day." The king examined the documents carefully, his trained eye picking up on the subtle ways the plan protected his authority while acknowledging the practical limitations imposed by his condition. After several minutes of review, he looked up with an expression that combined resignation with relief. "Very well, let's proceed with this approach," he agreed. "But I want regular evaluations of how it's working, and I reserve the right to resume full responsibilities if my condition improves or stabilizes." Dr. Thornfield arrived for a scheduled check-in just as they were concluding their discussion of the transition plan. Her presence had become a more regular feature of palace life, though her visits were carefully scheduled to avoid drawing attention from staff members who were not part of the inner circle managing the king's care. "Good morning, everyone," she said, noting the serious expressions around the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything critical." "Actually, your timing is perfect," the Queen replied. "We've been discussing practical arrangements for managing the king's schedule, and your input would be valuable in ensuring that our plans are medically sound." Dr. Thornfield reviewed the proposed transition plan, paying particular attention to the physical and cognitive demands of various activities. Her medical training allowed her to identify potential challenges that the others might have overlooked, and she suggested several modifications that would make the arrangement more sustainable over time. "The key will be maintaining flexibility," she advised. "The king's cognitive function will likely fluctuate from day to day, with some periods being better than others. We need systems that can accommodate these variations without creating public confusion or concern." This observation led to a discussion about the importance of maintaining consistent communication between all parties involved in the king's care and official duties. They established protocols for daily medical assessments, regular briefings between family members and staff, and contingency plans for situations where the king might not be able to fulfill scheduled commitments. As the morning progressed, other family members began arriving at the castle for what had been announced as a routine family gathering. Princess Anne arrived first, her practical approach to royal duties making her a valuable ally in developing realistic plans for the future. She had always been known for her direct communication style, which proved helpful in discussions that required honest assessments of challenging situations. "I've reviewed the briefing materials that Sir Edmund sent over," she announced without preamble as she joined the group in the morning room. "The plan seems sound, but I think we need to consider the international implications as well. Our relationships with Commonwealth nations and foreign governments could be affected if there's uncertainty about the king's capacity to fulfill his role." This was a perspective that hadn't been fully explored in their previous discussions, and it highlighted the global dimensions of the challenge they faced. The British monarchy's influence extended far beyond the United Kingdom, and any perceived instability could have diplomatic and political repercussions that needed to be carefully managed. Prince Charles, who had been conducting official business in Scotland, arrived later in the afternoon with his own set of concerns and suggestions. His experience in various royal roles gave him insights into the practical challenges of managing public expectations while dealing with private family crises. The most important thing is maintaining transparency with the family while being strategic about public communication, he advised during their expanded family meeting. We need everyone to understand what we're dealing with so they can provide appropriate support, but we also need to control the narrative to protect both father's dignity and the institution's stability. The conversation continued throughout the afternoon, touching on everything from medical care arrangements to security protocols to communication strategies. Each family member brought their own perspective and expertise, creating a comprehensive approach to managing a situation that none of them had ever imagined facing. As evening approached, the king requested some private time with the queen. The day's discussions had been emotionally and intellectually demanding, and he needed time to process the magnitude of the changes that were beginning to reshape his life and his role. The couple walked slowly through the gardens, their conversation too quiet for others to hear, but their body language conveying the deep connection that had sustained them through decades of public service. "It's strange," the king commented as they paused near the rose garden that had been one of his greatest pleasures over the years. "I've spent my entire life preparing for the responsibilities of monarchy, but no one ever teaches you how to let go of those responsibilities gracefully." The queen linked her arm through his, providing the physical and emotional support that had become increasingly important as they navigated this unprecedented challenge together. Her strength had always been a cornerstone of his ability to fulfill his duties, and now would be crucial in helping him maintain his dignity as those duties inevitably shifted to others. "We'll figure out together," she assured him, "just as we've figured out everything else over the years. And we'll make sure that whatever decisions we make, they serve the greater good, while honoring the commitment we made when we took on these roles." Inside the castle, the rest of the family continued their planning discussions, working through the complex logistics of implementing their transition strategy while maintaining the appearance of normal royal operations. The challenge before them was enormous, but their collective commitment to protecting both the king's welfare and the monarchy's stability gave them the motivation needed to tackle even the most difficult aspects of their situation. 6 months had elapsed since that initial devastating conversation with Dr. Thornfield, and the carefully orchestrated transition of royal duties had begun in earnest. The autumn sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. George's Chapel as the king prepared for what would likely be his final major ceremonial appearance as the fully active monarch. The annual service of remembrance held special significance this year, as it represented both a continuation of tradition and a subtle acknowledgement of the changing nature of his role. Lady Margaret Thorne, the newly appointed Deputy Private Secretary, stood beside Sir Edmund as they reviewed the final arrangements for the service. Her appointment had been one of several strategic additions to the royal household staff, ostensibly to handle the increasing complexity of modern royal duties, but actually designed to provide additional support as the king's condition continued its gradual but inexorable progression. The seating arrangements have been adjusted to ensure His Majesty has easy access to rest areas if needed, Margaret reported, consulting her tablet with the efficiency that had made her invaluable during the transition period. Prince William will be positioned to step in for any portions of the ceremony that become too demanding, though we've structured the service to minimize those requirements. Sir Edmund nodded approvingly. The past months had taught them all the importance of meticulous planning and backup systems. The king's condition fluctuated significantly from day to day, with some mornings bringing clarity and energy while others required careful management to maintain the appearance of normal functioning. Today appeared to be one of his better days, but they had learned not to take anything for granted. In the king's private apartments, Dr. Thornfield conducted her routine assessment with the thoroughness that had become essential for ensuring his safety during public appearances. The cognitive testing she performed each morning before major events had become more elaborate as his condition progressed, though she was careful to frame these evaluations as standard health checks rather than tests of his mental capacity. "Your speech patterns are clear this morning, and your recall of recent events seems strong," she reported to the small group gathered in the sitting room. I'm comfortable with proceeding as planned, though I recommend keeping the prepared remarks shorter than originally drafted. The Queen sat nearby, dressed in the elegant black ensemble she wore for remembrance ceremonies, her presence providing the steady support that had become increasingly crucial for the king's confidence during public appearances. She had developed an intuitive understanding of her husband's condition, often recognizing the early signs of confusion or fatigue before anyone else noticed them. "How are you feeling this morning, darling?" she asked gently, her voice carrying the warmth that had sustained their marriage through decades of public scrutiny and private challenges. "Are you comfortable with today's schedule, or would you like to make any adjustments?" The king straightened his ceremonial uniform with practiced precision, the familiar routine of preparing for official duties providing a sense of normalcy that helped anchor him when other aspects of his life seemed increasingly uncertain. His hands showed only the slightest tremor as he adjusted his medals, evidence of the neurological changes that were slowly but steadily altering his physical capabilities. "I'm feeling quite well today," he replied, though his voice carried a note of determination that suggested he was working harder than usual to maintain his composure. "This service means a great deal to me personally, and I'm grateful to be able to participate fully in honoring those who served our nation." Prince William arrived with his own family, their presence adding both comfort and a subtle reminder of the continuity that would sustain the monarchy beyond the current crisis. His children, now old enough to understand the gravity of their grandfather's situation, had been carefully prepared for what they might observe during today's ceremony. Their natural affection for the king provided moments of genuine joy that helped counterbalance the weight of official responsibilities. "Grandfather, you look very distinguished this morning," Princess Charlotte commented with a direct honesty that only children could manage. Her observation brought smiles to the adults gathered in the room, a reminder that even in the midst of serious challenges, family connections remained a source of strength and perspective. The king's face brightened at his granddaughter's words, and, for a moment, the concerns about his condition receded into the background. These interactions with his grandchildren had become increasingly precious as he struggled with the awareness that his time as an active part of their lives might be more limited than he had previously imagined. As the royal party prepared to depart for the chapel, Dr. Thornfield discreetly provided the Queen with a small device that would allow her to signal for medical assistance if needed during the ceremony. These precautions had become standard practice, though they were implemented so subtly that even close observers would be unlikely to notice them. The short journey to St. George's Chapel took place in the traditional state cars, with the King and Queen traveling together while other family members followed in subsequent vehicles. The route was lined with respectful crowds, many of whom had been attending remembrance services for decades, and represented a living connection to the history that the monarchy embodied. Inside the chapel, the congregation included military veterans, government officials, and representatives from organizations that supported military families and veterans' causes. The atmosphere was one of solemn respect, but also of genuine affection for the king, who had been a consistent advocate for military personnel throughout his reign. Many of those present had no idea of the medical challenges he was facing, seeing only the familiar figure who had represented stability and continuity for so many years. Canon Richardson, who had worked closely with the royal family for over a decade, had been briefed on the king's condition and had adjusted the service accordingly. The liturgy had been shortened slightly, key readings had been assigned to other participants, and strategic pauses had been built into the ceremony to provide rest opportunities without appearing unusual to the congregation. As the service began, the king's voice joined those of the congregation in the opening hymn, his baritone still strong and clear despite the medical challenges he faced. The Queen stood beside him, ready to provide support if needed, but allowing him to participate fully in this ceremony that held such personal and constitutional significance. The bishop's sermon focused on themes of service, sacrifice, and the continuity of values across generations, words that took on additional meaning given the transition that was quietly occurring within the royal family. His message about honoring the past while preparing for the future seemed to speak directly to the situation they were all navigating, though he was unaware of the specific challenges facing the king. When the time came for the traditional wreath-laying ceremony, the king moved forward with steady steps, though the queen remained close enough to provide assistance if needed. His placement of the wreath at the memorial was performed with the same dignity and reverence that had characterized his participation in such ceremonies for decades, giving no outward sign of the internal struggles he faced. Prince William participated in the ceremony with visible emotion, understanding as perhaps no one else could the weight of tradition he was gradually inheriting and the responsibility he felt to ensure its continuation. His own military service gave him a deep appreciation for the significance of the remembrance ceremony, while his evolving role within the family added layers of meaning to his participation. Following the formal conclusion of the service, there was a reception for military veterans and their families, an event that the king particularly enjoyed because it allowed for more personal interactions with people whose service he genuinely respected and appreciated. However, the informal nature of these conversations also presented challenges, as casual social interaction required a type of cognitive flexibility that was becoming increasingly difficult for him to maintain. Dr. Thornfield positioned herself strategically within the reception area, close enough to observe the king's interactions without appearing to monitor him. She had developed techniques for assessing his condition through subtle observation of his conversation patterns, body language, and social engagement, allowing her to provide guidance without obvious medical intervention. The queen proved particularly skillful at facilitating these social interactions, gently steering conversations in directions that played to her husband's strengths while helping him navigate moments when his memory or focus might falter. Her decades of experience in royal social events had always made her an effective partner, but now her support took on additional importance as she helped maintain his dignity during increasingly challenging situations. One particularly touching moment occurred when an elderly veteran approached the king with a photograph from World War II, showing the veteran's father in military uniform. The king's response was warm and engaged, drawing on the deep well of historical knowledge that remained largely intact despite his condition. These interactions reminded everyone present why he had been such an effective monarch, even as they highlighted the poignancy of what was gradually being lost. As the reception continued, careful observers might have noticed that the king's participation became somewhat more subdued and that the queen's presence became more protective. These subtle changes were managed so skillfully that most guests remained unaware of any issues, seeing only a distinguished elderly monarch engaging respectfully with people he clearly valued. Prince William circulated throughout the reception, engaging with veterans and their families while also keeping a discreet eye on his father's condition. His conversations revealed his growing comfort with these types of royal duties, as well as his genuine interest in the people he was meeting. The transition of responsibilities was occurring so gradually that it appeared to be a natural evolution rather than a response to crisis. Sir Edmund monitored the overall flow of the event, ready to make adjustments if the king showed signs of fatigue or confusion that might require intervention. His years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that preceded potential difficulties, allowing him to take preventive action before problems became apparent to outside observers. As the afternoon concluded, the royal family made their departure from the chapel with the same ceremonial dignity that had marked their arrival. The king appeared tired but satisfied with the day's events, having successfully participated in a ceremony that held deep personal meaning while fulfilling his constitutional responsibilities. The journey back to Windsor Castle provided an opportunity for quiet reflection on the day's successes and the challenges that lay ahead. The king's successful participation in such a significant public event was encouraging, but everyone involved understood that each such occasion required increasingly careful management and that future events might not go as smoothly. Dr. Thornfield's post-event assessment revealed that the king had performed better than expected, though she noted signs of fatigue that suggested the day's activities had been more demanding than he cared to admit. Her recommendations for future events included additional rest periods and even more strategic delegation of responsibilities to ensure his continued ability to participate meaningfully in important ceremonies. The evening was spent in quiet family time, with the king's grandchildren providing entertainment and distraction from the weight of official responsibilities. These moments of normalcy had become increasingly precious as the family adjusted to the reality of his condition and the changes it was bringing to their lives. As the day concluded, the queen and king sat together in their private sitting room, reviewing the events of the ceremony and discussing their feelings about what had been both a successful public appearance and a reminder of the challenges they continued to face. Their conversation touched on gratitude for the day's success, concern about future events, and the complex emotions surrounding a gradual transition that honored both tradition and medical reality. The winter months had brought with them a noticeable acceleration in the king's condition, and what had begun as subtle adjustments to royal protocol had evolved into more substantial changes that could no longer be entirely hidden from public view. The new year had arrived with both hope for medical stability and the sobering recognition that major decisions about the future of the monarchy could no longer be postponed. Dr. Thornfield's morning assessment revealed concerning developments that she had been tracking over the past several weeks. The king's cognitive fluctuations had become more pronounced, with periods of clarity becoming shorter and episodes of confusion lasting longer. More troubling was the emergence of behavioral changes that suggested the condition was progressing faster than the specialists had initially predicted. "I'm afraid we're seeing acceleration in several key areas," Dr. Thornfield reported to the assembled group in the Queen's private study. "The language difficulties are becoming more frequent, and there are signs of spatial disorientation that could pose safety risks during public appearances. Most concerning is the increased difficulty with executive function, which affects decision-making and complex reasoning." Sir Edmund absorbed this information with the gravity it deserved, understanding that the medical deterioration was approaching a point where public disclosure would become unavoidable. The careful balance they had maintained between protecting the king's privacy and fulfilling constitutional responsibilities was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. "How much time do we realistically have before these changes become impossible to manage publicly?" Sir Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would not be what any of them wanted to hear. "The specialists believe we may have weeks rather than months before the symptoms become obvious to outside observers," Dr. Thornfield replied. "The language issues in particular are becoming difficult to compensate for, and the spatial confusion could create dangerous situations during ceremonial events." The Queen sat quietly throughout this discussion, her composed exterior masking the emotional turmoil she was experiencing as she watched her husband's gradual decline. The man who had been her partner in all aspects of life for nearly 5 decades was slowly disappearing, though moments of his familiar self still emerged with enough frequency to make the overall situation even more heartbreaking. Prince William arrived at that moment, having driven directly from London after receiving an urgent call from Sir Edmund. His face showed the strain of recent weeks, during which he had been gradually assuming more of his father's responsibilities while trying to maintain the fiction that these changes were temporary adjustments rather than permanent transitions. "What's the current situation?" William asked without preamble, having learned to appreciate direct communication about his father's condition rather than the diplomatic language that had characterized their early discussions of the crisis. Dr. Thornfield repeated her assessment for William's benefit, providing additional detail about the specific symptoms and their likely progression. The medical complexity of the king's condition was challenging enough, but the constitutional implications of his deteriorating capacity created layers of urgency that affected every decision they made. "We need to make some fundamental decisions about disclosure and transition," Williams said after absorbing the medical update. "The public has a right to understand what's happening, and we have constitutional obligations that we can't continue to fulfill indefinitely under these circumstances." The question of public disclosure had been haunting all their discussions for months, with arguments on multiple sides about the timing and extent of information that should be shared. The king himself had been clear about his desire to maintain privacy and dignity, but the reality of his condition was making such privacy increasingly difficult to preserve. "Your father was quite clear yesterday," during one of his more lucid periods that he wants to participate in any decisions about disclosure. The Queen interjected. He may be struggling with many things, but his core personality and values remain intact. He deserves to have a voice in how this situation is handled. This reminder brought the discussion back to the human dimensions of their crisis, beyond the constitutional and political considerations that necessarily dominated their planning. The king's dignity and autonomy remained paramount, even as his capacity to exercise that autonomy became increasingly compromised. Sir Edmund had prepared several scenarios for public disclosure, ranging from general statements about health concerns to more detailed explanations of the king's condition and its implications for royal duties. Each approach carried different risks and benefits, both for the royal family's privacy and for public confidence in the monarchy's stability. The Prime Minister's office has been asking increasingly pointed questions about His Majesty's health, Sir Edmund reported. They're concerned about the constitutional implications and want to ensure proper protocols are followed if formal transition arrangements become necessary. The involvement of government officials added another layer of complexity to their situation, as constitutional requirements intersected with family concerns and medical realities. The monarchy's role in British government meant that any significant changes in the king's capacity had implications that extended far beyond the royal household. Prince Charles arrived from Scotland for what had been scheduled as a routine family meeting, but had evolved into a crucial strategy session about the future. His legal background provided valuable perspective on the constitutional questions they faced, while his role as a senior member of the royal family gave him insights into the practical challenges of managing public expectations. I've been consulting with constitutional experts about the options available to us, Charles reported. There are precedents for regency arrangements, but they require formal parliamentary involvement that would make public disclosure inevitable. The alternative is a more gradual transition of specific duties, but that approach has its own legal complexities. Princess Anne joined them later in the morning, bringing her characteristic directness to discussions that sometimes became mired in diplomatic language and constitutional technicalities. Her practical approach to royal duties had always been valuable, but it proved especially helpful when dealing with situations that required clear decision-making despite emotional difficulty. The bottom line is that we can't continue indefinitely with the current arrangements, and stated bluntly, Father's condition is deteriorating. The public will eventually notice, and we have obligations to the country that require decisive action. The question is whether we act proactively or wait until circumstances force our hand. This perspective, while difficult to hear, reflected the reality that all of them understood but had been reluctant to articulate so directly. The king's capacity was declining at a rate that would soon make public appearances impossible to manage safely, regardless of their desires to protect his privacy and dignity. Dr. Thornfield's afternoon assessment brought additional concerning news about the king's physical condition. The neurological deterioration was beginning to affect his motor control and balance, creating safety risks that extended beyond the cognitive symptoms they had been managing. Falls and other physical injuries were becoming genuine concerns that required immediate attention. We need to implement additional safety measures immediately, Dr. Thornfield advised. This includes modifications to his living quarters, changes to his daily routine, and consideration of mobility aids that can be used discreetly during public appearances. The practical implications of these safety requirements were sobering, as they represented visible changes that would be difficult to explain away if noticed by staff members or public observers. The progression from subtle cognitive adjustments to obvious physical accommodations marked a significant escalation in the challenges they faced. The king himself appeared for the late afternoon discussion, though his participation was noticeably different from previous family meetings about his condition. His speech was slower and more deliberate, and he required prompting to stay focused on the topics under discussion. Despite these difficulties, his fundamental dignity and concern for others remained evident. I understand that my condition is worsening, he said with characteristic directness. I also understand that this situation affects not just our family, but the entire nation. Whatever decisions need to be made, they should prioritize the stability and continuity of the monarchy above any personal considerations. The Queen reached for his hand as he spoke, providing both physical and emotional support during what was clearly a difficult conversation for him to navigate. Her own strength in the face of these challenges continued to inspire everyone around her, even as the personal cost of watching her husband's decline became increasingly apparent. We want to honor your wishes and maintain your dignity throughout this process, William assured his father. But we also need to ensure that the country's interests are protected and that constitutional requirements are met. Finding the right balance is challenging, but we're committed to getting it right. The discussion continued throughout the evening, touching on everything from immediate medical care to long-term succession planning. Each topic brought its own complexities, but the overarching theme was the need to balance competing priorities while maintaining the integrity of the monarchy as an institution. Dr. Thornfield's final assessment of the day painted a sobering picture of the trajectory they could expect in the coming weeks and months. The king's condition would continue to deteriorate, with periods of relative stability punctuated by more noticeable declines in various cognitive and physical capabilities. Medical interventions could slow the progression somewhat, but could not prevent the inevitable advancement of his neurological condition. The most important thing now is ensuring his comfort and safety while maintaining as much dignity as possible, Dr. Thornfield concluded. The family support will be crucial, both for his emotional well-being and for managing the practical challenges that each day will bring. As the evening drew to a close, the royal family found themselves facing decisions that would fundamentally alter not only their personal lives, but also the future of the monarchy itself. The king's condition had progressed beyond the point where private management was sufficient, and public acknowledgement of his situation was becoming inevitable. The queen spent the final hours of the day with her husband, sharing quiet moments that had become increasingly precious as his condition progressed. Their conversation touched on memories from their long marriage, concerns about the future, and gratitude for the time they had been given together in service to the nation. Whatever happens in the coming weeks and months, the king said with a clarity that had become less frequent in recent days, I want you to know how grateful I am for everything we've shared. Our partnership has been the greatest joy of my life, and I'm confident that you and the children will ensure the monarchy continues to serve the people well. The Queen's response was quiet but firm, reflecting the commitment that had sustained their marriage and their joint service for so many decades. We'll face whatever comes together, just as we always have, and we'll make sure that the institution we've dedicated our lives to protecting remains strong for future generations. Outside, the winter night settled over Windsor Castle, bringing with it the quiet that had always provided refuge from the demands of public life. But inside the king's chambers, the reality of impending change filled the silence. As a family and a nation prepared to navigate the most challenging transition the monarchy had faced in generations. The decisions that would be made in the coming days would shape not only the immediate future, but the long-term legacy of a reign that had been defined by dedication, service, and an unwavering commitment to duty above personal comfort.